Our companion network, C-SPAN 2, welcomes 3,280 new subscribers at Harlan Cable of Harlan, Kentucky. Harlan and cable companies all across the country are adding C-SPAN 2 to their systems. In just the first half of this year, 3.5 million new subscribers can watch C-SPAN 2's coverage of the U.S. Senate and public policy issues. Now, Washington Journal continues.
Former Senator George McGovern, what did you find in the paper, first of all, that most interested you today?
Well, I was intrigued by a story quoting Rich Rusk, the son of the late Dean Rusk, commenting on Mr. McNamara's book. I thought it was a very thoughtful and unique perspective coming from someone whose father was also one of the major architects of the war. He made the point that however controversial, it's a good thing that McNamara's book was written. It's probably 25 or 30 years too late to save any lives, but he makes the point that in the long run, this can be a healing book because it does make clear that even those right at the top of the administration during the 1960s and 70s had serious doubts about the war that now need to be made a part of the historical record. He says, in effect, that he wishes his father had made the same kind of statement, however late in the day, but that he was just psychologically incapable, once American lives were lost, of conceding that a mistake had been made.
Of course, being the Democratic Party's nominee in 1972 puts you right in the middle of all of this debate. What is your thoughts on the publication of this book, personally?
Well, I think it's a good thing. It's awfully late in the day. I don't understand anyone who had serious questions about what we were doing in Vietnam as early as 1965, not saying so at the time. Interestingly enough, McNamara and Dean Rusk and others apparently had the view that their first loyalty was to the President of the United States. I don't understand that theory. I think when you work for the United States government, your first responsibility is to the American public. Your first responsibility beyond that is to your own conscience. And if you have genuine doubts about a policy that is jeopardizing and indeed claiming the lives of young Americans, you ought to say so, even if you have to resign in the process. We've had principled resignations in the past. Elliot Richardson resigned as Attorney General because he disagreed with a certain policy that the Nixon administration was insisting on. Cy Vance resigned during the Carter administration for a similar reason. So that was the thing Mr. McNamara should have been done. Now, having said that, I applaud him, however late in the day, for having the courage to say, I was wrong. The war was wrong, as he put it, terribly wrong. And I think that will help to clarify the record. In the long run, while it produces controversy now, I think in the long run it'll help heal the wounds of Vietnam.
Lynne Cheney, what are you reading this morning?
I was interested in the headlines in the Washington Times. Clinton cools rhetoric aimed at talk radio. And this is really an idea that carries on from what Senator McGovern was saying. It is important when people have doubts about national policy, when they have concerns about the federal government's having grown too large and too powerful in our lives. It's important for people to speak out. And I think what the president did day before yesterday in condemning people who speak out, who worry about the overpowering weight of the federal government, and trying to link those people to the tragedy, to the horror, to the murderous act that occurred in Oklahoma City, I think that was totally irresponsible. And I think it is a good thing for the president to be backing off on some of that rhetoric.
Well, Ms. Cheney, I'm one of your admirers. I think you did a great job when you were in public office, as I do your husband. But I don't read that into this story.
Well, we're reading different stories. You're reading the Post, and I'm reading the Times, and they can be alternative universes.
I understand, but I just wanted to read the quotes on what the president says here. We must stand up and speak against reckless speech that can push fragile people over the edge beyond the bounds of civilized conduct. And then he goes on to say, such words, whether it comes from the left or the right. In other words, he's not talking just about right-wing groups. He says the left-wing extremists are equally dangerous. And he says whether it comes on radio, television, or in the movies, whether it comes in the schoolyard or, yes, even on college campuses. I think it's not a back down, it was a clarification of what he said. The press immediately jumped to the conclusion that what the president was talking about was only right-wing talk show hosts, and so the follow-up statement wasn't a retraction of that. It was simply saying, I didn't say talk show hosts only. I was talking about people on the left, on the right, in the movies, on television, on campuses, any place where you have this reckless kind of rhetoric. But
well, he did say that yesterday. You're absolutely right, but it was backing off, because the day before he had said that we need to beware of people who regularly spread messages of hate and violence over the airwaves. And that, in context with the other things he had said about radio talk show hosts earlier, made it perfectly clear what he was talking about. I'm very glad to see the clarification.
Yeah. Well, let me just say I fully agree with the president's warning against hate talk, whether it comes from the left or the right. I do
But
think,
it is not the same as principled dissent.
No, I
as
agree.
You well know.
I agree with that. As a matter of fact, I'm one of the country's well-known dissenters.
Principled dissenters, I would agree.
I spoke out against Vietnam. But you know, sitting here looking out at the Capitol of the United States, I don't understand people who dissent, who carry it to the point where they seem to just scorn the whole United States government.
On the left or on the right?
On the left or the right. There's never been a time in my life when I was objecting to specific policies, whether it was Vietnam or some other issue, that it wasn't based on devotion and love of this country and of its government. I still think we have the best government in the world. I think we've got the best Constitution, the most competent civil service, the best foreign service, the best armed forces anywhere in the world. And it's concern that we can do better that has led to dissent on my part. But when I listen to some of these people on the radio and on television spouting a line that almost represents genuine hatred and contempt for the whole American system, for the whole United States, I think that's dangerous. I think that it stirs up the kind of sick-minded people who were involved in the bombing. It's not that anybody on the left or right was deliberately trying to provoke a bombing attack, but that kind of irresponsible rhetoric, I think, creates a climate where sick-minded people act in the way they think is the best way to make their point, and that's to set off a bomb.
But if you want to talk about people stirring up hatred of the United States government, I think one of the most powerful examples of that we've seen in recent years is Oliver Stone's film, JFK. And I was interested the other night in a talk show to see one of the Arizona sheriffs who was sympathetic with the citizens militia say Oliver Stone demonstrated that this government is corrupt. I mean, what an interesting thing, because what Stone, of course, was trying to demonstrate was that Kennedy had been killed in order to make sure that we kept troops in Vietnam as the military-industrial complex wished us to. I think it's very important to emphasize again and again that there is extremism on the left, and I certainly run into it on college campuses all the time,
I saw
as well as on the right.
I saw it in the anti-war movement back. I was a part of the anti-war movement, but I was repulsed by some of the things I saw on the part of extremists who I thought actually hurt the anti-war movement. I remember a parade in Atlanta one day, perfectly peaceful protest against the war. I was with Mrs. Martin Luther King and with the mayor of Atlanta, perfectly moderate, patriotic American who just happened to be against the war. And as we got in view of the television cameras, a young couple jumped out from the curb. They'd torn up the American flag. The girl was wearing a piece of it as a kind of a miniskirt and a bra. The fellow was wearing a piece of it in what I guess you could only describe as a jockstrap.
A loincloth,
and
maybe.
they jumped out in front of the cameras carrying a sign saying "Stop the war." That hurt the anti-war effort. So yes, you're right. There have been extremist hate movements on the left as well as the right, and they're both to be deplored.
Let me jump in for a minute and introduce our audience to our discussion. We have two special guests at our table this morning. Lynne Cheney, who served as chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities in both the Reagan and Bush administrations, 1986 through 1993. Currently at the American Enterprise Institute, where you are serving as a distinguished fellow. What are you up to these days?
I'm just finishing up a book that will be out in the fall, and it takes up many of the cultural issues that underlie the kinds of things that Senator McGovern and I were speaking about.
Lynne Cheney has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin, her home, Wyoming, taught at several colleges and university, and was a magazine editor and author, and wrote a history of the U.S. House of Representatives along with her husband, co-authored that with her husband, former Defense Secretary Dick Cheney. George McGovern, also at our table this morning. I mentioned he was the Democratic presidential nominee in 1972. Our audience gets increasingly younger, Senator McGovern, so I have to put in details like that for our younger audience. Was also a senator from South Dakota and has a PhD in history and government from Northwestern University. Served in the U.S. House of Representatives, in the Senate from 62 to 74, a delegate to the General Assembly of the United Nations, many other items on his bio. But you have been serving as president of the Middle East Policy Council for a number of years.
That's correct. For the last 4 years, I've been president of the Middle East Policy Council. It's a informational and educational group that frankly is trying to educate the American public on the realities of the Middle East. There are a number of former government people on our board who are interested in Middle East affairs.
Let me go back to newspaper articles. What's another one that you found of interest this morning?
Well, I thought the lead editorial in the Washington Post just commenting on some of the proposals that have been made by the Congress and by the President to deal with terrorism were well taken. The Post made the point that we're all concerned about terrorism, but in the kind of crisis, traumatic spirit that exists following this monstrous act in Oklahoma is not necessarily the best time to devise a long-term strategy for dealing with terrorism. We don't want to go overboard where, in effect, we take a particular tragedy and create another one by ill-advised legislation. I think Senator McCain was warning against that yesterday, and the Post says the same thing today. I'm glad to see that Senator Dole is quoted in that lead editorial today, warning about going too fast, and maybe we ought to take time to take a second look at some of these proposals.
Lynne Cheney, what else are you reading?
The New York Times has the letter from the person called the Unabomber, an excerpt from it on its front page, and it's very interesting, terrifying in a way, but terrifying totally. Reading this letter from the Unabomber and putting it together with what we're learning about the bombing in Oklahoma City seems to suggest that what we have occurring is an anarchist movement. It's coming from across the spectrum. It's people who simply don't want there to be order in society. And the fact that the Unabomber thinks that the way to accomplish this is to kill off a person in the forest industry, I think tells you that these connections are being made in very strange and unpredictable ways. He apparently sees this person who was killed by the bomb in San Francisco as a representative of the industrial system of the country, and so he thinks that he's promoting the cause of anarchy by murdering him. It's so irrational that it is, I think, very concerning.
If you'd like to join in our discussion this morning, here's how you do it. We have our telephone lines, and we'll put those C-SPAN phone numbers on the screen, 202-624-1111 if you're watching us in the Eastern or Central time zones, 202-624-1115 if you're watching us in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, our fax number, 202-624-0762, and our email address, cspanguest@aol.com. Senator McGovern brought up the legislative response internal security issues. I'm curious from both of you. We have been having a discussion about this on our programs for the past week about this free and open society on the one hand and people's increasing concerns about their own safety and similar issues about safety of friends and family. How do you balance this out in the kind of country that we have?
Well, I certainly agree with Senator McGovern that we don't want to rush to legislation. I think that would be a big mistake. I haven't studied in detail the proposals that are being made, but as I've heard people commenting on them, it sounds to me as though we do have in place areas in which the FBI can infiltrate these groups that could indeed provide us with the kind of safety we're seeking without further impinging upon people's right to privacy. I do think that is a very large concern. Just as we don't want to infringe on people's right to free speech, and that's what had worried me about the President's original comments, neither do we want to infringe on the right to privacy. The amendments to the Constitution are very important. The Bill of Rights is very important.
Well, I think that's right. It's this whole problem of how you balance off the claims of security, which we're all interested in, against the claims of personal freedom, which we're also interested in, has been a difficult one throughout American history. You can go back to the Alien and Sedition Acts in the Adams administration back, I guess that would have been about 1798. Those acts were passed in a moment of hysteria. At that time, the big fear was French influence in American life. And the Federalists, in effect, pushed through measures that said anybody that criticizes the government is subject to arrest and imprisonment. It was obviously an incredible threat to our constitutional freedoms. Fortunately, those acts were later set aside, but we've been struggling with it ever since. I remember back in the 70s there was an outbreak of concern about excesses on the part of federal agencies. Yeah, there were excesses. The FBI was wiretapping. It did various things to try to trap the late Martin Luther King that really had nothing to do with the security of the country. And so the executive branch put through some guidelines to restrict what the FBI could do. But I've read here in the last few days, and I've heard on some of the celebrated talk shows that we've been discussing here, suggestions that those measures tied the hands of the FBI. That's just not true. The FBI could have infiltrated this group that they suspected perpetrators of the bombing were connected with. There's nothing to restrict them from doing that. So I think we have to be careful, and I'm glad to see that both on the part of Democrats and Republicans that concern is being expressed. We need to protect our freedoms, and at the same time, we need to take reasonable steps to deal with the terrorist threat.
You know, there was here in the 30s, right here in Washington, some incidents of terrorism, the Red Scare. There were bombs that went off. One actually went off on our street and blew a person apart. It was actually the bomber himself. It was carelessly done. And the result of that was the Red Scare, which historians generally agree went too far in trying to infiltrate these groups, control these groups so far that the Constitution was indeed threatened.
We have about 40 minutes for your calls. Let's begin with Vienna, Virginia. Good morning.
Good morning. A couple of comments and a question. First off, I'd like to keep current. I mean, I realize that throughout our history we've had radicals and reactionaries on both sides, but let's keep it in context with the current atmosphere in America, which seems to be primarily reactionary response from the right wing of our society. And while I agree with the President totally on this, there's been a lot of venom spewed from the media. What bothers me is what I've heard from Congress, not so much the people who are paid to speak on the air, but people who are paid to lead us. That's what troubles me, is the kind of rhetoric I've heard from people in government itself.
For example, who?
Well, I mean, I think the Speaker comes to mind right off the bat. For one, I think Mr. Army is another one. I think Mr. Dole, Mr. Graham is another one. The kind of anti-government rhetoric that they espouse and that's fairly harsh is upsetting. The other comment I have is a question. if we had had the balanced budget amendment in effect, would that have meant that Congress would have had to reconvene, have a debate, then a vote, and then a cost analysis for the president to act in this situation? I'd like a response. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Lynne Cheney, you want to start?
Well, I disagree with your caller. I think that being concerned about the growing size of the federal government, as Speaker Gingrich and Leader Armey have been, is quite different from being irresponsible rhetorically, and to suggest that leading politicians are somehow connected with the Oklahoma bomber. Well, it drew a very harsh response from Speaker Gingrich when this suggestion was first made. It's about like suggesting that somehow Senator McGovern was responsible for the Symbionese Liberation Army. Of course he wasn't. He was making principled dissent, and it was not that dissent that led people to do things that were wild and irresponsible.
Senator McGovern?
Well, I think the caller, though, does make a point. We're trying to be fair here this morning and represent the danger of extremism from all sides, but it is a fact that today's mood is one in which the right wing is riding high. Let me just state my own personal view on this. I think we've had two great traditions in American politics from the very beginning. Conservatism, on one hand, is a perfectly valid, respectable intellectual and political system, which incidentally my parents pursued all their lives, and liberalism, which is the tradition of Jefferson and Jackson and Roosevelt and Truman, and it's the tradition I follow, which is also a respectable and absolutely essential part of our political dialogue. What has concerned me in recent years is that some of the public figures that have just been mentioned here by the caller do seem to me have gone over the line in their contempt for the whole liberal tradition. I think it would be good if you're going to make
a charge like that, Senator, to give a specific example.
Gingrich is a good example.
No, but give me a specific example.
Well, the way he talks about liberalism as though it was somehow a kind of an alien ideology in American life.
I hear that on Good Morning America or on the Today Show from Brian Gumbel every day about conservatism.
I'm not saying this is exclusive. I'm saying that the mood of the moment is one in which liberalism is denigrated and scorned. You've never heard me do that about conservatism.
Conservatism has been denigrated and scorned for as long as I've been alive. I mean, it's real. This is Rashomon for you to think that somehow conservatives have not.
The caller was talking about the mood of the moment here, and I think
he wasn't. He was specifically attacking Speaker Gingrich and Dick Armey.
Well, he was asked to name specifics. He didn't do this until he was asked to name certain people in the Congress.
John Dingell said yesterday that people holding public office give credibility to the kind of thing that happened in Oklahoma City. I really am a great admirer of John Dingell's, and I am a good friend of his wife Debbie's, but when you're talking about irresponsible rhetoric on the part of public men, this struck me as right in that category.
Let me go back to the call. Senator, we can pick this up because I know other callers are going to be involved in this discussion, unless you've got something you really want.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm just trying to find a quote here in today's press.
All right, you keep looking because we will.
We have such a pile of papers to look through.
Right.
Atlanta's next. Good morning.
Yes, I want to say that at the time that I heard about the bombing, I feel that all of our whole country was just ready to and eager to jump in together in love and healing for Oklahoma and for everybody. And we've all been through a lot. I still remember my husband's body being brought home in a casket that you couldn't open because it would smell. And right away, though, here is Geraldo over there rubbing those women on the back with his mascara running. And it just seemed so out of place. And then Clinton and his wife got up there and they made all these wonderful little things, and everybody was so thrilled. And I thought, oh, my God, this man has done something I like. And then he starts what I feel was a very ugly turn, that he's pointing the finger, and he was making me feel guilty for voting for what I felt was right. And I was so disappointed that to use this for a political soapbox. And I'm really sorry for all the people that bad things have happened to. And I just wish that people with the power, for instance, that he has, could just grow to it.
Thanks very much.
I really appreciate that caller giving us her thoughts. The president did do a good job. Until this one thing we're talking about, I think he and Mrs. Clinton have both done a superb job of leading us through a period of great sorrow. It's very easy to get involved in these political fights and to forget for a minute or two the children who were killed, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to do that. That would be a great error.
Senator McGovern, did you find something you were looking for?
I didn't find the specific quote I was looking for here. You know, I agree with the thrust of what the caller has just said. This is such a sad and tragic and monstrous thing to happen that I find myself almost reluctant to comment on it other than to deplore it. But I think the president has handled it well. I think he's been constructive. I think he's been non-partisan about it. I don't see the evidence that he was trying to make political points. I think that speech that he made the other night, if you listen to it all the way through, which I did, was one of the better speeches he's given. It was a thoughtful effort in which he called on the American people and called on all of us to lower the rhetoric a little, to lower the emotional and reckless content of what we say. I hadn't intended to mention anybody's name on this program today, but I do think that we have to be careful about trying to make partisan points about something that is far deeper than any partisan division.
Yuma, Arizona, good morning.
30 years ago, the Democrats did themselves considerable harm by trying to defend the weathermen and the Black Panthers and the flag burners and so forth. And now the Republicans are doing exactly the same thing. The litany always goes, oh, I don't condone such things, but. And as soon as they issue that word, you know just exactly where they stand. Now, Ms. Cheney's a little more artful than most, but it's the same thing. This has got to be denounced completely, without reservation.
I denounce it completely and without reservation.
All right.
Just one corrective. I don't think the Democrats as a party or their leadership ever endorsed the weatherman or the flag burners or the bomb throwers in the 1960s. Those were extremist elements.
You would denounce them completely and without reservation.
Absolutely. I did at the time, and I do it in retrospect, and I think that was the position of the Democratic Party all the way through those anti-war activities. People recognized that there was a legitimate basis for the anti-war movement, but no Democratic official that I can think of, no Democratic body that I can think of ever endorsed these violent methods that took over a rather small extremist element on the fringe of the anti-war movement.
One of the things we do on Washington Journal is follow all of the news and public policy and public affairs magazines as they come out, either weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. Today's the day to look at the new Mother Jones magazine, which is out for June 1995. And we've been talking a lot about talk radio, and look who's on the cover this month. Busting Rush is their cover story. And this is a piece written by Molly Ivins about Rush Limbaugh. But we're going to take a look inside for just a minute and talk on the phone with Eric Bates, who has written for the magazine a profile. It's a series, Mr. Bates, isn't it, that Mother Jones does, what you need to know about certain politicians?
Yeah, this is a series that Mother Jones has been doing, particularly on some of the new conservative leadership.
And this month is about Jesse Helms. Much has been written about Senator Helms over the years. What did you find new to tell your readers?
Well, that was a bit of a challenge because a lot has been written about the senator. He's been in office for almost 25 years now. I think one of the things that struck me as I looked into his career was how much his voting record differs from his rhetoric. He likes to position himself as a populist defender of the little guy, an opponent of big government, and in fact his voting record indicates that he's in favor of an activist, big spending government when it comes to helping the wealthy, bailing out the savings and loans industry, supporting missile systems. He really only gets budget-cutting minded when it comes to ordinary folks, opposing parental leave, opposing safety standards for daycare centers, supporting cuts in medical care for disabled veterans. I was really struck by how his voting records is at odds with his image.
You talk in this piece about Senator Helms' fundraising abilities.
Well, the senator has always been known for being able to raise great sums of money and for having a fundraising machine to do it. From the very beginning, he started the National Congressional Club, now known as the Conservative Club, to eliminate his first campaign debt, and it quickly became one of the most lucrative fundraising machines in the country. He has now distanced himself from it, broken off formal ties with it, because its a spin-off group is under investigation by the feds, and it's been fined several times for illegal campaign activities. But for many years, it's served him well.
I want to read a paragraph to you, and I'd like to ask Lynne Cheney if she can get involved in this discussion, because, of course, now Senator Helms is heading the committee that looks at foreign policy issues, but in past years, very much involved in the debate over arts funding in the country, in a time when you were also looking at the same. In this, you write that some voters are also attracted to Helms by the personal qualities that make him a rarity among politicians. He brings genuine passion and a sense of moral purpose to what he does. He stands on principle and refuses to compromise. He stands by his friends, and he forces opponents to vote on issues that they would rather ignore. And Cheney, does that sound like the Senator Helms you know?
I have always been struck by the difference between the picture that you get of Senator Helms in most profiles. This one does sound unique, and one that I'm interested in reading, as a sort of rough-hewn fellow who would be rude and elbow people out of his way. And in they've been very limited, but in the times I've had to meet with the senator, I've always been struck by what a gentleman he is. And I would suspect that that goes along with what this writer has found. He's a man who is extremely polite. He doesn't seem to have the arrogance that often characterizes those who achieve high and powerful positions. And that has always struck me, which seems to go along somewhat with what this writer is saying.
Mr. Bates, do you agree? Is that what you found?
Oh, there's no question that in his personal relationships, Helms is every bit the Southern gentleman. There's a great distance between his personal relationships and his stance on public policy when it comes to how gentlemanly he is. And he's also willing to be rude and be abrasive in order to make his points when it comes to politics.
In a similar light, one of the parts of your piece which the magazine chose to highlight, his racial politics are deeply held convictions, not simply politics of convenience, says one Helms watcher. He has a view of fundamentalist Christian society in which everyone is not welcome. You do spend some time exploring his religious and societal views. What are they in your estimation?
Well, Helms grew up in a very segregated time and place in the South in the 1920s, and he's carried that with him all his life. And has not really strayed from that path, which is one thing that people admire about him. That at a time long after politicians like George Wallace and Strom Thurmond began to court black voters, Helms has continued a politics of divisiveness, of sending cues to white voters of where he stands on the issue of race.
You've been watching him since he took the chairmanship of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Has he surprised you there?
I think one thing that a lot of congressional staffers told me that they were uncertain about was how abrasive Helms was going to be as chair. As ranking minority member, he was always on the offensive, always using the rules to stymie debate or to direct debate in the directions that he wanted it to go. And as chair, he's been an equal defender of the rules in terms of making sure everyone gets a chance to speak and that proper procedure is followed. But he's also in a very powerful position as chair to set the agenda, and he's used that to highlight the issues that he's wanted to highlight.
With regards to his relationship with the media, you said, first of all, that Senator Helms would not talk to you for this piece. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And why is that?
Well, it didn't offer any explanation. Helms has always had a very combative relationship with the media. and it's one of his favorite straw men with the voters. He loves to come home and position himself as a victim of the media and as a target of the media.
If I were Senator Helms, I wouldn't have talked to Mother Jones. I think this is probably a wise political decision and has nothing to do with his wish to beat up on the media.
Mr. Bates?
I don't know whether he was trying to beat up on the media or not by not talking to me, but I do know that his history of relationship with the media has been very combative.
Could he ever have expected a favorable profile from Mother Jones?
I think this profile is fair. I don't know if he could have expected a favorable one, but I was certainly interested in talking to him and in hearing his views and his positions.
He's 73 years old. What did you either find out or have others speculate on his intentions to run again in '96?
Well, he has, since the article appeared, or since I wrote it, announced that he will be running. So he says he's in fine health. Other people worry that his age and his history of health problems may be catching up with him.
Thanks very much for talking to us.
Thanks.
Next month, Mother Jones will be also doing another in their series of What You Need to Know About, and the subject next month will be Phil Graham. And when it comes out, we'll be talking with the author of that piece as well. You can also hear, just make sure that you understand we're doing this in a bipartisan basis. We have the American Spectator, the Nation magazine, the New Republic, and others as they go to press each cycle. Senator McGovern? As a member of the United States Senate, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the role. Here we are talking about it, chairman of a major committee. And if I can find it here, I found a piece this morning written by Gene McCarthy in a newspaper called The Hill. And he writes about three senators who inspire him, Senator Fulbright, Senator Morse, and Senator Hatfield. The late Wayne Morse, Mark Hatfield, both Republicans of Oregon, and also Senator Fulbright. And it was actually going to Senator Fulbright's funeral that inspired this piece by former Senator McCarthy. He writes, each in a distinctive way demonstrated his understanding that the Senate had a special role in American government, that it is not a super House of Representatives, that it has special obligations to protect the integrity of the courts, and that it has special obligations in the field of foreign policy and for government administration.
Well, I agree with those observations, including the three senators that he singled out for special praise. Let me just say, as a Democrat, I've long admired the independence and courage of Senator Hatfield, a prominent Republican and chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And I think a man of real integrity. He and I teamed up on the McGovern-Hatfield amendment to end the war many years ago. He was criticized for that very sharply in Oregon. Of course, I was in South Dakota. But I always thought that one of the things that saved us both politically is that it was a bipartisan proposal. Senator Fulbright, who was singled out there, and I was also at his funeral recently, I think performed a great service to this country when he conducted extended hearings right in the middle of the Vietnam War, examining that policy as effectively as it's ever been examined since then or before that. So these people that he singled out, I think, are deserving of high praise.
Lynne Cheney, any comments on the Senate or the specific senator we just finished talking about?
No, I think it is interesting that we have seen for most of my lifetime what I would call the hegemony of the Senate. If you look to Washington and you look to where you will find politicians of note, we've always looked to the Senate. I think that changed after the '94 elections, and I think that we're now in a new period where perhaps people will become more acquainted with not only the House of Representatives, but various members in it. And for those of us who have special ties to the House of Representatives and a special affection for the other body, this is a good thing to see the House come into its own.
You know, one thing I've noticed about the Senate, and since I've served in both the House and the Senate, I share in your recognition that the House is a vital part of our government. But one of the things I've always loved about the Senate is that when this country gets into a difficult problem, it always seems to me that somebody stands up in the Senate, maybe it's several people stand up, and force a re-examination of whatever's under debate. I think Robert Byrd did that on the balanced budget amendment. Regardless of whether you're for or against the balanced budget amendment, it took a lot of courage on the part of Bob Byrd to confront that, coming from a rather conservative state. He himself is a conservative man. Ordinarily, you'd expect him to go along with but I thought that took courage. One of the callers earlier asked us if that amendment had passed, could President Clinton have dealt with the bombing crisis in Oklahoma City under the balanced budget amendment? I forgot to comment on that, and I guess you did too, Lynn. But what I think the answer to that is that the president does have contingency funds to deal with matters of that kind, probably with or without a balanced budget amendment.
I just want to add that I think one of the most eloquent, informative, engaged debates that we have seen in the last decade or so in Washington was the House of Representatives debate on the Gulf War.
Yes.
It was really quite remarkable.
Excellent debate, and President Bush was very wise to wait until after that vote before committing American forces. One of the reasons I think that the country was behind the president's decision is they knew that the Congress was behind him.
We have your earlier debate and discussion about speech in society has engendered many faxes, but I want to get to them in a minute. We're going to take a call, but one short fax with a quick answer is from a viewer who faxes from a hotel, who writes, Susan, I'm stuck here in the Big Apple with no OJ updates. How about a ticker light crawl across the bottom of the screen? Brian already said no, but hey, it's your show. Long-time watcher, first-time faxer, and we will remain OJ-free, despite the fact that that viewer is, it's hard to imagine that you can be devoid of any news about the O.J. Simpson trial, no matter where you're staying. But rest assured, to those of you who've found this spot where there's no discussion of it, it will remain that way. Tampa, Florida, good morning. You're on the air.
Yeah, I would like Ms. Cheney to try and defend as vehemently as she's defending the right-wing conservative talk show host Jesse Helms' comment to President Clinton that if he comes to North Carolina, he needs a bodyguard. Newt Gingrich's comment to the First Lady that she's a bitch. Mr. Army's, these are all Republicans, correct? Whether or not Barney Frank's name is Barney Fag. Now, if you don't think that that galvanizes or tends to gel hatred towards Democrats and towards government in general, I ask you simply, how do you defend those comments?
Okay, now I've lost track. What am I supposed to defend? What was the first one?
The comments, one of them was Newt Gingrich and the comment about...
Well, the speaker said he didn't say it.
The one was Barney Frank and the Dick Army's...
Dick Army said he hadn't meant to say it. It was an awful thing. He was sorry.
And I've forgotten the third one as well.
The third one was the best, though. What was...
Carl, are you still there?
Yeah, Jesse Helms.
Oh, right.
Oh, that was awful.
He needs a bodyguard.
That was awful, and Senator Helms said it was awful. So I'm not here to defend hate speech of any kind. What I am here is to defend free speech. We should not, as a result of a horrible tragedy, come down on the right of people to speak their mind in this country any more than we should begin to invade people's privacy as a result.
Okay, let me go back to the, thank you, caller, for that. You said not here to defend hate speech. Who defines what is hate speech, and should there be restrictions on it?
No, there should not. And this is, I think, the most interesting place, and I'll bet Senator McGovern would agree with this. This is the most interesting place to talk about the First Amendment. The government shall not abridge the right of freedom of speech. It's very easy to defend free speech as long as people are saying things that you're comfortable with. It's when they begin to say things you aren't comfortable with that you really show your commitment to the First Amendment by saying, I really don't want you to say that. I really don't like your saying that, but it is your right to say it. And so I do not defend the thoughts that are sometimes expressed, but I do defend the right of people to say just about anything in this country except to shout fire in a crowded theater.
Senator McGovern, on our program yesterday, we had a woman who phoned in and suggested that in this program where we have the phones open all the time, hear from a lot of people, it is the responsibility of those sitting in my chair to cut off offensive or hate speech. We've got another fax like that this morning. One suggestion, you request people to place a call only once a month. At the same time, could you make a statement such as, differing opinions are welcome, but we ask that you not participate in hate speech? Now, we think about this a lot here, but keep coming back to the central question. Who defines what's hate speech?
Well, I don't think you can do that. I think that we recognize hate speech when we hear it. I know one of the talk show hosts publicly said that he uses President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton, their pictures, for target practice. That came from Mr. Gordon Liddy. That's hate speech, and it's dangerous, and it's inflammatory. Not to you and to me and others that are here this morning. We see something like that, we're not going to go out and get a gun and shoot at the president.
But does he have the right to say it in the society?
I don't know how you prevent it. I don't know how you can put up a litany of what vocabulary is acceptable and what is not. You have to make the warning about it. You have to appeal to the people who talk that way and try to get them to re-examine the impact of what they're saying.
But it does become, it is the question of yelling fire in the crowded theater. You know, that I don't know that that this was said on Mr. Liddy's talk show. But as soon as you start talking about shooting people, killing people, blowing things up, you're getting very close to the line of shouting fire in a crowded theater.
Exactly right. This fellow that's been in the news recently that heads the so-called Michigan militia, talking about how we're going to meet the United States government with overwhelming firepower the next time. Somebody else was quoted as saying the bombing attack in Oklahoma was like a great Rembrandt painting. It was carried out so beautifully. That kind of obvious inflammatory and damaging talk is something that shouldn't be on the airwaves. It shouldn't be anywhere in this country, but I don't know how you can legislate against it. I think that you have to run the risk of people spouting that kind of hatred on the air in order to make sure that freedom of speech is protected. I find it repulsive. I find it inflammatory. I do think that kind of language contributes to the atmosphere that created this recent bombing, whether it was intended by the speaker or not. But it's a very difficult thing in a free society to spell out in legislation or even by the courts what is acceptable.
Thing, of course, in New York, the story goes on and on and on about Leonard Jeffries of City University of New York and his speeches, which are clearly anti-Semitic. At what point can you say, all right, if you want to talk like that, if you want to spew hatred like that, you will not be chairman of the Black Studies Department at the City University of New York? It's a question that's been difficult to handle throughout our history.
About 12 minutes left with our two special guests at the table this morning. We have time for more of your calls. Let's go to Mount Vernon, New York.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I just admire C-SPAN so much, and I really feel it's just a wonderful example of this morning program of how people, and every morning, how people can disagree and yet be civil, be courteous, and many times show they really like each other. And I admire your two guests. I am a longtime admirer of Senator McGovern, a wonderful man. And our country is so blessed to have had him to serve us. And I admire our president. I am not a Democrat. I am not a Republican. I've voted independently all my life. And I just feel that what the president is telling us is just to, I don't think we should have legislation. I completely agree with what's been said. And I don't agree with the caller yesterday that C-SPAN should, monitor what people are going to say. But that's the reason what the president has said is so important. He's appealing to our higher nature and saying the way you say to kids when they're fighting, come on now, play nicely, children. You can have a happy time. You don't have to hit each other, And I feel that this is a way of hitting each other, this loud, angry voices at one another. We can disagree. That's fine. There's nothing wrong. We don't have to all think the same, but we can all support each other. We can be kind to one another.
Caller, thanks very much. Mount Vernon, New York. That was a comment, not a question.
No, it was a very good comment.
We'll move on to
Very
the
nice.
next call from Los Angeles. Good morning.
Hi, Susan. Morning. I have 3 points. I'll try to get through them as quickly as possible, if I may. First of all, I just want to talk about just a quick response to Ms. Cheney about Oliver Stone and his movie. Anybody that wants to look at the public record can get Peter Dale Scott's book, Deep Politics, which clearly states Kennedy was pulling out of Vietnam with National Security Document 263, and it was reversed in 273, and then he goes into the assassination and what have you. There was actually a real Mr. X, which appeared in Oliver Stone's movie, named Colonel Prouty, who described also the assassination. I don't have time to go into it now, but anybody who's interested can get Peter Dale Scott's book, Deep Politics. It's a matter of the public record in terms of those documents. Secondly, in dealing with the hate that people are mentioning on the show and why people hate so much these days, I think it's important to understand that people are under extreme economic pressure in this country now. And it's sad that some people react the way they do, but with the collapse of the dollar and the collapse of incomes the way they are, and no one even talking about increasing the corporate taxes to make up for the increased taxes on middle-class people, and their wages dropping because of the social mechanisms that have been taken away because of lack of a want for people to use government.
And number 3?
Number 3, yes. I'll move on quickly. Might lose a couple of people here, but I think this is very important, which is in concern with the bombing. Let us not forget that in New York, Sheik Rockman, who is convicted now of doing the New York bombing, has very serious national security ties in terms of working with our Central Intelligence Agency. Even CNN reported this in Terror Nation U.S. Creation. And I don't think that we should take this lightly. And considering what the CIA has done in the past, if you just look at the Church Committee hearings and how they're going to benefit from this bombing in terms of this kind of legislation that's being proposed to take away our civil liberties, I think we should at least be suspicious and maybe even look into an investigation into the Central Intelligence Agency and the kind of activities that they've been doing.
Okay, I do have to interrupt you because you've had lots of time here.
It's one thing for a caller to call in and suggest that the CIA has connections with people who have bombed the World Trade Center. I mean, that's just the paranoid style of American politics. It's out there. I wish your caller didn't believe that because he's completely wrong. But it's entirely another thing for someone like Oliver Stone to spend $14 million or whatever it was to put on a film like JFK that suggests that the Kennedy assassination was essentially an attempted coup d'etat, that it involved the CIA, the FBI, Lyndon Johnson, the military forces of this country. And one of the reasons I think it's so totally irresponsible is because people like your caller believe it. Stone not only put out this theory that is just totally wrong and completely irresponsible, he goes around and says to this day that it is true. And I was watching C-SPAN the other day. There was an interview with some close-up students from here in this area, and a young woman from a Washington, D.C. high school completely bought into the whole Oliver Stone theory that the United States government was essentially and fundamentally corrupt and had been involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. If you want to talk about rhetoric that is irresponsible, that makes people feel as though anarchy is the right way to go, I can't think of a better example.
I think that's essentially right. I think there's too much of the conspiracy theory functioning in American politics today. Oliver Stone has made some great movies. I think the one on JFK was not one of those. I've always thought it was ridiculous to blame the tragic assassination of President Kennedy on some great conspiracy inside the federal government. The Kennedy family that has probably studied this tragedy as closely as anyone, Senator Edward Kennedy, who's still in the Senate, his brother Robert Kennedy, both of them have told me over the years that they accept essentially the findings of the Warren Commission, which held that President Kennedy was killed by a single assassin. There may have been somebody else on that famous knoll in Dallas. But to imply that somehow Lyndon Johnson, the Vice President and the Attorney General and the Joint Chiefs and the whole United States government was involved in this assassination doesn't serve the purpose of either truth or democracy. I think the same thing about people today who think that the United States government is a conspiracy against them because the government collects taxes. Those who think that the government is out to take away every gun in the country, they operate under this conspiracy theory, and they feed the kind of nutcases that we have out there with the Michigan militia and other operations of this kind.
Let me quickly go through some of these faxes, and I'll just leave them as comments because I suspect not only will we hear these, but many others in the days ahead as we discuss the role of speech in our society and its contribution to some of the problems we deal with. This is from Berlin, Maryland. C-SPAN, we agree wholeheartedly with the president about the radical right and left radio shows. They seem to incite the uninformed people who listen to them. And this, why does the president call anyone who disagrees with him a hater, an extremist, etc.? Dissension is an important component of a healthy democracy. And we'll move on to the next. Let's see if I can do this without dropping my pages here. This is from Honolulu. As an 11-year veteran of local talk radio, I can assure you that the spoken word has an immeasurable effect on the audience. Rush Limbaugh and G. Gordon Liddy have in the past and do still incite people to a crisis level. And this, it is lamentable we have an open society filled with closed minds. We'll go back to calls. Cincinnati, good morning.
Good morning to everybody. Ms. Cheney, after listening to you, I'm just wondering, was it all right that Mr. Gingrich, after the what happened with Susan Smith and her children, stood there and blamed the liberals and the Democrats for that? Was that all right that he did that? And wasn't that not for, that was right before the elections in November.
I'm not familiar with this. If anyone blamed liberals for Susan Smith's killing her children, that would certainly be an error.
Right in front of the microphones, and said this is a result of liberal policy.
It does resemble a little too closely, in my mind, what President Clinton did day before yesterday in blaming radio talk show hosts for the bombing in Oklahoma City.
Houston, Texas, good morning. Houston, you there?
Hello.
Yes, you're on the air.
Yes, thank you, C-SPAN. I believe that the British probably thought that a lot of things that the colonists were saying would be considered hate speech, especially against their king. And we have to put up with not enjoying what others say, because that is what freedom of speech is all about. And there's nothing wrong with people having guns and having weapons that can fight a government that is foreign or domestic. If the British had met the American colonists and all they had was pea shooters, they couldn't have fought the British. And that's just the way it has to be. Thank you.
Can I comment on that? I don't know how anyone who has studied American history would assume that living under an American democracy, which we have had for the last 200 years, entitles people to view the United States government today the same as they viewed British imperialism 200 years ago.
The caller did that.
I think he did. I think
he said.
He said if we hadn't had guns, we couldn't have resisted the British. And why shouldn't we have guns today to resist a government?
But no, he didn't add that last part.
Yes,
maybe,
he did.
Maybe my.
Yeah, I think you missed it, Lynn, because the clear implication.
Well, maybe there's an implication. I didn't even hear an implication. I do think that it's a.
I heard loud and clear him say that why shouldn't people carry guns, and why shouldn't they be the kind of a gun that enables people to resist the encroachments of their government. And he went on to add, if we hadn't had those kind of weapons, we couldn't have stood up against the British.
Well, you know, it is interesting. You and I hear different things. What I heard him say is that the Constitution does give us the right to bear arms, that that right was in the beginning a defense against tyranny and an effort to protect the safety of one's home, and that people should have the right to bear guns today, to bear arms.
Nobody's calling for the repeal of the Second Amendment.
That's what I thought we would probably attack him for.
I wasn't saying that at all. But
suggesting that there would be no guns.
I don't think you would suggest either that there shouldn't be some kind of regulations on how guns are carried and where they're carried. I think you would agree that the right to bear arms doesn't include the right to make bombs.
Oh, well, of course, that's absolutely right. But you and I could have a whole program on whether or not gun control has any effect at all on the people who tend to use guns to kill other people.
I can only say I think practically every policeman in the country supports my view that we shouldn't be walking around with assault weapons with multiple firing guns that have no purpose other than to kill people.
But some of the smartest comment on this has been made by James Q. Wilson, whom I'm sure you've read and whose writings I would guess we both admire.
Yes.
What he points out is that gun control simply isn't effective, that gun control does not get guns away from the people who are using them to commit acts of mayhem and violence.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm an old hunter. I own shotguns, and I grew up with rifles and shotguns. I'm not suggesting that people don't have that right. I don't think people have the right to walk around with an assault weapon.
What about a handgun?
Handguns, there again, ought to be with a permit. A person who's going
with a permit. Most people have permits
That's
now.
correct. Well, they should all have permits.
So what would you like to have? Well, if they all had permits, then the criminals would have them.
I'm for the Brady bill, which these gun nuts want to repeal, that requires a waiting time.
See, now, I think that may be a little irresponsible to call everyone who doesn't like the Brady bill a gun nut.
Well, I stand on it.
I'm not a gun nut, and I'm not for the Brady bill.
Well, you disagree with President Reagan.
I don't care. It still doesn't make me a gun nut, Senator.
I'd have to say that anyone that disagrees with the Brady bill, moderate restrictions of that kind, is a gun nut.
Well, I really hate to close this program with calling names, so maybe what we should do is look at a very pretty picture. I want to be sure that the viewing audience remembers Ginger Rogers. I was struck by this wonderful picture in the Washington Post this morning, and Tom Shales has written a really quite lovely article to accompany it. She died, of course, and she gave us so much grace to remember.
I knew you and I could end on a harmonious note.
But we
I fully endorse the late Ginger Rogers, who's brought joy and beauty to all of us for as long as I can remember, and I greatly mourn her passing.
And your timing was impeccable because we are out of time. Thank you for ending the program on a note with another issue altogether, and appreciate both of your commentary throughout the program. Come back, please. That's it for our newspaper roundtable segment, but there's much more ahead on Washington Journal. If you do have a comment about anything you've heard, there's lots of ways to get in touch with us. Our address, 400 North Capitol Street Northwest, Suite 650, Washington, D.C., 20001. Our telephone numbers, 202-626